Chapter 4 Gorp Hunt. But the interruption had disturbed the tenor of trading. The small chief who had so eagerly taken Paff's place had only 2 chorus stones to offer, and even to Dane's inexperienced eyes they were inferior in size and color to those the other clan leader had tendered. The Terrans were aware that chorus mining was a dangerous business, but they had not known that the stock of available stones was so very small. Within 10 minutes, the last of the serious bargaining was concluded, and the clansmen were drifting away from the burned-over space about the Queen's standing fins. Dane folded up the bargain cloth, glad for a task. He sensed that he was far from being back in Van Ryck's good graces. The fact that his superior did not discuss any of the aspects of the deals with him was a bad sign. Captain Jellicoe stretched. Although his was not, or never what might be termed a good-humored face, he was at peace with his world. "That would seem to be all. What's the haul, Van?" 10 first-class stones, about 50 second grade, and 20 or so of third. The chiefs will go to the fisheries tomorrow. Then we'll be in to see the really good stuff. And how's the herbs holding out? That interested Dane, too. Surely the few plants in the hydro and the dried leaves could not be stretched too far. "As well as we could expect," Van Ryck frowned. "But Craig thinks he's on the trail of something to help." The storm priests had uprooted the staff marking the trading station and were wrapping the white streamer about it. Their leader had already gone, and now Tau came up to the group by the ramp. "Van says you have an idea," the captain hailed him. "We haven't tried it yet, and we can't unless the priests give it a clear lane." "That goes without saying," Jellicoe agreed. The captain had not addressed that remark to him personally, but Dane was sure it had been directed at him. Well, they needn't worry. Never again was he going to make that mistake. They could be very sure of that. He was part of the conference which followed in the mess cabin only because he was a member of the crew. How far the reason for his disgrace had spread he had no way of telling, but he made no overtures, even to Rip. Tau had the floor with Mura as efficient lieutenant. He discussed the properties of catnip, and gave information on the limited supply the Queen carried. Then he launched into a new suggestion. Felines of Terra, in fact a great many other of our native mammals, have a similar affinity for this. Mura produced a small flask, and Tau opened it, passing it to Captain Jellicoe, and so from hand to hand around the room. Each crewman sniffed at the strong aroma. It was a heavier scent than that given off by the crushed catnip. Dane was not sure he liked it. But a moment later Sinbad streaked in from the corridor and committed the unpardonable sin of leaping to the tabletop just before Mura, who had taken the flask from Dane. He meowed plaintively and clawed at the steward's cuff. Mura stoppered the flask and put the cat down on the floor. "What is it?" Jellicoe wanted to know. "Anisette, a liquor made from the oil of anise, from seeds of the anise plant. It is a stimulant, but we use it mainly as a condiment. If it is harmless for the Salariki, it ought to be a bigger bargaining point than any perfumes or spices IS can import. And remember, with their unlimited capital, they can flood the market with products we can't touch, selling at a loss if need be to cut us out. Because their ship is not going to lift from Sargol just because she has no legal right here." "There's this point," Van Ryck added to the lecture. "The IZs are trading, or want to trade, perfumes, but they stock only manufactured products, exotic stuff, but synthetic." He took from his belt pouch 2 tiny boxes. Before he caught the rich scent of the paste inside them, Dane had already identified each as luxury items from Casper, chemical products which sold well and at high prices in the civilized ports of the galaxy. The cargo master turned the boxes over, exposing the symbol on their undersides, the mark of IS. These were offered to me in trade by a Salaric. I took them just to have proof that the IZs are operating here. But note, they were offered to me in trade, along with 2 top koros for what? 1 spoonful of dried catnip leaves. Does that suggest anything? Mura answered first. The Salariki prefer natural products to synthetic. I think so. Do you suppose that was Cam's secret? Speculated astrogator Steen Wilcox. If it was, Jellicoe cut in, he certainly kept it. If we had only known this earlier. They were all thinking of that, of their storage space carefully packed with useless trade goods. Where, if they had known, the same space could have carried herbs with 5 or 25 times as much buying power. Maybe now that their sales resistance is broken, we can switch to some of the other stuff, Tang Ya, torn away from his beloved communicators for the conference, said wistfully. They like color. How about breaking out some rolls of Harlinian moth silk? Van Ryck sighed wearily. Oh, we'll try. We'll bring out everything and anything. But we could have done so much better. He brooded over the tricks of fate which had landed them on a planet wild for trade, with no proper trade goods in either of their holds. There was a nervous little sound of a throat being apologetically cleared. Jasper Weeks, the small wiper from the engine-room detail, the third-generation Venusian colonist whom the more vocal members of the Queen's complement were apt to forget upon occasion, seeing all eyes upon him, spoke, though his voice was hardly above a hoarse whisper. Cedar, lackelbarch, forshweed. Cinnamon, Mura added to the list. Imported in small quantities. Naturally. Only the problem now is, how much cedar, lackelbark, forshweed, cinnamon do we have on board? Demanded Van Ryck. His sarcasm did not register with Weeks, for the little man pushed by Dane and left the cabin to their surprise. In the quiet which followed, they could hear the clatter of his boots on ladder rungs as he descended to the quarters of the engine-room staff. Tang turned to his neighbor, Johann Stotz, the Queen's engineer. What's he going for? Stotz shrugged. Weeks was a self-effacing man, so much so that even in the cramped quarters of the spacer very little about him as an individual impressed his mates, a fact which was slowly dawning on them all now. Then they heard the scramble of feet hurrying back, and Weeks burst in with energy which carried him across to the table behind which the captain and Van Ryck now sat. In the wiper's hands was a plastisteel box, the treasure chest of a spaceman. Its tough exterior was guaranteed to protect the contents against everything but outright disintegration. Weeks put it down on the table and snapped up the lid. A new aroma, or aromas, was added to the scents now at war in the cabin. Weeks pulled out a handful of fluffy white stuff which frothed up about his fingers like soap lather. Then, with more care, he lifted up a tray divided into many small compartments, each with a separate sealing lid of its own. The men of the Queen moved in, their curiosity aroused, until they were jostling one another. Being tall, Dane had an advantage, though Van Ryck's bulk and the wide shoulders of the captain were between him and the object they were so intent upon. In each division of the tray, easily seen through the transparent lids, was a carved figure. The weird denizens of the Venusian polar swamps were there, along with lifelike effigies of Terran animals, a Martian sand-mouse in all its monstrous ferocity, and the native animal and reptile life of 100 different worlds. Weeks put down a second tray beside the first, again displaying a menagerie of strange life forms. But when he clicked open one of the compartments, and handed the figurine it contained to the captain, Dane understood the reason for now bringing forward the carvings. The majority of them were fashioned from a dull blue-gray wood, and Dane knew that if he picked one up he would discover that it weighed close to nothing in his hand. That was lacal bark, the aromatic product of a Venusian vine, and each little animal or reptile lay encased in a soft dab of frothy white, froshweed, the perfumed seed casing of the Martian canal plants. One or two figures on the second tray were of a red-brown wood, and these Van Ryck sniffed at appreciatively. "Cedar. Terran cedar," he murmured. Weeks nodded eagerly, his eyes alight. "I am waiting now for sandalwood. It is also good for carving." Jellicoe stared at the array in puzzled wonder. "You made these?" Being an amateur xenobiologist of no small standing himself, the shapes of the carvings more than the material from which they fashioned held his attention. All those on board the Queen had their own hobbies. The monotony of voyaging through hyperspace had long ago impressed upon men the need for occupying both hands and mind during the sterile days while they were forced into close companionship with few duties to keep them alert. Jellicoe's cabin was papered with 3D pictures of rare animals and alien creatures he had studied in their native haunts, or of which he kept careful and painstaking records. Tau had his magic. Mura not only had his plants, but the delicate miniature landscapes he fashioned, to be imprisoned forever in the hearts of protecting plastiballs. But Weeks had never shown his work before, and now he had an artist's supreme pleasure of completely confounding his shipmates. The cargo-master returned to the business on hand first. "You willing to transfer these to cargo?" he asked briskly. "How many do you have?" Weeks, now lifting a third and then a fourth tray from the box, replied without looking up. 200. Yes, I'll transfer, sir." The captain was turning about in his fingers the beautifully shaped figure of an Astran duocorn. "Pity to trade these here," he mused aloud. "Will Paft or Halfer appreciate more than just their scent?" Weeks smiled shyly. "I filled the case, sir. I was going to offer them to Mr. Van Ryck on a venture. I can always make another set. And right now, well, maybe they'll be worth more to the Queen, seeing as how they're made out of aromatic woods, than they'd be elsewhere. Leastwise, the Izies aren't going to have anything like them to show." He ended in a burst of honest pride. "Indeed they aren't." Van Ryck gave honor where it was due. So they made plans, and then separated to sleep out the rest of the night. Dane knew his lapse was not forgotten nor forgiven, but now he was honestly too tired to care, and slept as well as if his conscience were clear. But morning brought only a trickle of lower-class clansmen for trading, and none of them had much but news to offer. The storm priests, as neutral arbitrators, had divided up the chorus grounds, and the clansmen, under the personal supervision of their chieftains, were busy hunting the stones. The Terrans gathered from scraps of information that gem-seeking on such a large scale had never been attempted before. Before night there came other news, and much more chilling. Paft, one of the two major chieftains of this section of Sargol, while supervising the efforts of his liegemen on a newly discovered and richly strewn length of shoal water, had been attacked and killed by a gorp. The unusual activity of the Salariki in the shallows had in turn drawn to the spot battalions of the intelligent, malignant reptiles who had struck in strength, slaying and escaping before the Salariki could form an adequate defense, having killed the land-dweller sentry silently and effectively before advancing on the laboring main bodies of gem-hunters. A loss of a certain number of miners or fishers had been pre-seen as the price one paid for Koros in quantity. But the death of a chieftain was another thing altogether, having repercussions which carried far beyond the fact of his death. When the news reached the Salariki about the Queen, they melted away into the grass forest, and for the first time the Terrans felt free from spying eyes. "What happens now?" Ollie inquired. "Do they declare all deals off?" "That might just be the unfortunate answer," agreed Van Ryck. "Could be," Rip commented to Dane, "that they'd think we were in some way responsible." But Dane's conscience, sensitive over the whole matter of Salariki trade, had already reached that conclusion. The Terran party, unsure of what were the best tactics, wisely decided to do nothing at all for the time being. But when the Salariki seemed to have completely vanished on the morning of the second day, the men were restless. Had Paff's death resulted in some inter-clan quarrel over the airship, and the other clans withdrawn to let the various contenders for that honor fight it out? Or, what was more probable and dangerous, had the aliens come to the point of view that the Queen was in the main responsible for the catastrophe, and were engaged in preparing too warm a welcome for any traders who dared to visit them? With the latter idea in mind, they did not stray far from the ship, and the limit to their traveling was the edge of the forest from which they could be covered, and so they did not learn much. It was well into the morning before they were dramatically apprised that, far from being considered in any way an enemy, they were about to be accepted in a tie as close as clan to clan during one of the temporary but binding truces. The messenger came in state, a young Salaric warrior, his splendid cloak rent and hanging in tattered pieces from his shoulders, as a sign of official grief. He carried in one hand a burned-out torch, and in the other an unsheathed claw-knife, its blade reflecting the sunlight with a wicked glitter. Behind him trotted 3 couples of retainers, their cloaks also ragged fringes, their knives drawn. Standing up on the ramp to receive what could only be a formal deputation were captain, astrogator, cargo master, and engineer, the senior officers of the spacer. In the rolling periods of the trade lingo, the torch-bearer identified himself as Groft, son and heir of the late lamented Paft. Until his chieftain father was avenged in blood, he could not assume the high seat of his clan, nor the leadership of the family. And now, following custom, he was inviting the friends and sometimes allies of the dead Paft to a gorp hunt. Such a gorp hunt, Dane gathered from amidst the flowers of ceremonial Salariki speech, as had never been planned before on the face of Sargol. Salariki without number in the past had died beneath the ripping talons of the water reptiles, but it was seldom that a chieftain had so fallen, and his clan were firm in their determination to take a full-blood price from the killers. "And so, Sky Lords," Groft brought his oration to a close, "we come to ask that you send your young men to this hunting, so that they may know the joy of plunging knives into the scaled death and see the horned ones die bathed in their own vile blood." Dane needed no hint from the Queen's officers that this invitation was a sharp departure from custom. By joining with the natives in such a foray, the Terrans were being admitted to kinship of a sort, cementing relations by a tie which the IS, or any other interloper from off-world, would find hard to break. It was such a piece of excellent good fortune as they would not have dreamed of 3 days earlier. Van Ryck replied, his voice properly sonorous, sounding out the rounded periods of the rolling tongue which they had all been taught during the voyage, using Cam's recording. Yes, the Terrans would join with pleasure in so good and great a cause. They would lend the force of their arms to the defeat of all Gorp they had the good fortune to meet. Groff need only name the hour for them to join him. It was not needful, the young Salariki chieftain-to-be hastened to tell the cargo-master, that the senior Skylords concern themselves in this matter. In fact, it would be against custom, for it was meet that such a hunt be left to warriors of few years, that they might earn glory and be able to stand before the fires at the naming as men. Therefore, the thumb claw of Groft was extended to its greatest length as he used it to single out the Terrans he had been eyeing. Let this one, and that, and that, and the fourth be ready to join the Salariki party an hour after nooning on this very day, and they would indeed teach the slimy, treacherous lurkers in the depths a well-needed lesson. The Salarik's choice, with one exception, had unerringly fallen upon the youngest members of the crew, Ollie, Rip, and Dane in that order. But his fourth addition had been Jasper Weeks. Perhaps because of his native pallor of skin and slightness of body, the oiler had seemed, to the alien, to be younger than his years. At any rate, Groft had made it very plain that he chose these men, and Dane knew that the Queen's officers would raise no objection which might upset the delicate balance of favorable relations. Van Ryck did ask for one concession, which was reluctantly granted. He received permission for the Spacer's men to carry their sleep rods. Though the Salariki, apparently for some reason of binding and hoary custom, were totally opposed to hunting their age-old enemy with anything other than their duelist weapons of net and claw-knife. "Go along with them," Captain Jellicoe gave his final orders to the four, "as long as it doesn't mean your own necks, understand? On the other hand, dead heroes have never helped to lift a ship. And these Gorp are tough from all accounts. You'll just have to use your own judgment about springing your rods on them." He looked distinctly unhappy at that thought. Ollie was grinning, and Little Weeks tightened his weapon belt with a touch of swagger he had never shown before. Rip was his usual soft-voiced self, dependable as a rock and a good base for the rest of them, taking command without question as they marched off to join Groff's company. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Perilous Seas. The Gorp hunters straggled through the grassed forest in family groups, and the Terrans saw that the Enterprise had forced another uneasy truce upon the district, for there were representatives from more than just Paf's own clan. All the Salariki were young, and the parties babbled together in excitement. It was plain that this hunt, staged upon a large scale, was not only a means of revenge upon a hated enemy, but also a sporting event of outstanding prestige. Now the grass trees began to show ragged gaps, open spaces between their clumps, until the forest was only scattered groups, and the party the Terrans had joined walked along a trail cloaked in knee-high, yellow-red fern growth. Most of the Salariki carried unlit torches, some having 4 or 5 bundled together, as if Gorp hunting must be done after nightfall. And it was fairly late in the afternoon before they topped a rise of ground and looked out upon one of Sargol's seas. The water was a dull metallic gray, broken by great swaths of purple, as if an artist had slapped a brush of color across it in a hit-or-miss fashion. Sand of the red grit, lightened by the golden flecks which glittered in the sun, stretched to the edge of the wavelets, breaking with only languor on the curve of earth. The bulk of islands arose in serried ranks farther out, crowned with grass trees all rippling under the sea wind. They came out upon the beach where one of the purple patches touched the shore, and Dane noted that it left a scummy deposit there. The Terrans went on to the water's edge. Where it was clear of the purple stuff, they could get a murky glimpse of the bottom, but the scum hid long stretches of shoreline and outer wave, and Dane wondered if the Gorp used it as a protective covering. For the moment, the Salariki made no move toward the sea which was to be their hunting ground. Instead, the youngest members of the party, some of whom were adolescents not yet entitled to wear the claw-knife of manhood, spread out along the shore and set industriously to gathering driftwood, which they brought back to heap on the sand. Dane, watching that harvest, caught sight of a smoothly polished length. He called Week's attention to the water-rounded cylinder. The oiler's eyes lighted as he stooped to pick it up. Where the other sticks were from grass trees, this was something else. And among the bleached pile it had the vividness of flame, for it was a strident scarlet. Weeks turned it over in his hands, running his fingers lovingly across its perfect grain. Even in its crude state it had beauty. He stopped the Salariki who had just brought in another armload of wood. "This is what?" He spoke the trade lingo haltingly. The native gazed somewhat indifferently at the branch. "Tansil," he answered. "It grows on the islands." He made a vague gesture to include a good section of the Western Sea before he hurried away. Weeks now went along the tide line on his own quest, Dane trailing him. At the end of a quarter-hour, when a hail summoned them back to the site of the now-lighted fire, they had some 10 pieces of the tansil wood between them. The finds ranged from a 3-foot section some 4 inches in diameter to some slender twigs no larger than a writing stilo, but all with high polish, the warm flame coloring. Weeks lashed them together before he joined the group where Groft was outlining the technique of gorp hunting for the benefit of the Terrans. Some 200 feet away, a reef, often awash and stained with the purple scum, angled out into the sea in a long curve, which formed a natural breakwater. This was the point of attack. But first the purple film must be removed so that land and sea dwellers could meet on common terms. The fire blazed up, eating hungrily into the driftwood, and from it ran the young Salariki with lighted brands, which at the water's edge they whirled about their heads and then hurled out onto the purple patches. Fire arose from the water and ran with frantic speed across the crests of the low waves, while the Salariki coughed and buried their noses in their perfume boxes, for the wind drove shoreward an overpowering stench. Where the cleansing fire had run on the water there was now only the natural metallic gray of the liquid. The cover was gone. Older Salariki warriors were choosing torches from those they had brought, doing it with care. Groft approached the Terrans, carrying 4. "These you use now." What for? Dane wondered. The sky was still sunlit. He held the torch, watching to see how the Salariki made use of them. Groft led the advance, running lightly out along the reef with agile and graceful leaps to cross the breaks where the sea hurled in over the rock. And after him followed the other natives, each with a lighted torch in hand. The torch they hunkered down to plant firmly in some crevice of the rock before taking a stand beside that beacon. The Terrans, less sure-footed in the space boots, picked their way along the same path, wet with spray, wrinkling their noses against the lingering puffs of the stench from the water. Following the example of the Salariki, they faced seaward. But Dane did not know what to watch for. Cam had left only the vaguest general descriptions of Gorp, and beyond the fact that they were reptilian, intelligent, and dangerous, the Terrans had not been briefed. Once the warriors had taken up their stand along the reef, the younger Salariki went into action once more. Lighting more torches at the fire, they ran out along the line of their elders and flung their torches as far as they could hurl them into the sea outside the reef. The gray steel of the water was now yellow with the reflection of the sinking sun. But that ochre and gold became more brilliant yet as the torches of the Salariki set blazing up far-floating patches of scum. Dane shielded his eyes against the glare and tried to watch the water, with some idea that this move must be provocation, and what they hunted would so be driven into view. He held his sleep rod ready, just as the Salariki on his right had claw-knife in one hand, and in the other, open and waiting, the net intended to entangle and hold fast a victim, binding him for the kill. But it was at the far tip of the barrier, the post of greatest honor which Groft had jealously claimed as his, that the Gorp struck first. At a wild shout of defiance, Dane half turned to see the Salaric noble cast his net at sea level and then stab viciously with a well-practiced blow. When he raised his arm for a second thrust, greenish ichor ran from the blade down his wrist. "Dane!" Thorson's head jerked around. He saw the V of ripples headed straight for the rocks where he balanced. But he'd have to wait for a better target than a moving wedge of water. Instinctively, he half-crouched in the stance of an embattled spaceman, wishing now that he did have a blaster. Neither of the Salariki stationed on either side of him made any move, and he guessed that was hunt etiquette. Each man was supposed to face and kill the monster that challenged him without assistance. And upon his skill during the next few minutes might rest the reputation of all Terrans as far as the natives were concerned. There was a shadow outline beneath the surface of the metallic water now, but he could not see well because of the distortion of the murky waves. He must wait until he was sure. Then the thing gave a spurt, and only inches beyond the toes of his boots, a nightmare creature sprang halfway out of the water, pincher claws as long as his own arms snapping at him. Without being conscious of his act, he pressed the stud of the sleep rod, aiming in the general direction of that horror from the sea. But, to his utter amazement, the creature did not fall supinely back into watery world from which it had emerged. Instead, those claws snapped again, this time scraping across the top of Dane's foot, leaving a furrow in material the keenest of knives could not have scored. "Give it to him!" That was Rip shouting encouragement from his own place farther along the reef. Dane pressed the firing stud again and again. The claws waved as the monstrosity slavered from a gaping frog's mouth, a mouth which was fanged with a shark's vicious teeth. It was almost wholly out of the water, creeping on a crab's many legs, with a clawed upper limb reaching for him, when suddenly it stopped, its huge head turning from side to side in the sheltering carapace of scaled natural armor. It settled back, as if crouching for a final spring, a spring which would push Dane into the ocean. But that attack never came. Instead, the Gorp drew in upon itself until it resembled an unwieldy ball of indestructible armor, and there it remained. The Salariki on either side of Dane let out cries of triumph and edged closer. One of them twirled his net suggestively, seeing that the Terran lacked what was to him an essential piece of hunting equipment. Dane nodded vigorously in agreement, and the tough strands swung out in a skillful cast which engulfed the motionless creature on the reef. But it was so protected by its scales that there was no opening for the claw knife. They had made a capture, but they could not make a kill. However, the Salariki were highly delighted, and several abandoned their post to help the boys drag the monster ashore, where it was pinned down to the beach by stakes driven through the edges of the net. But the hunting party was given little time to gloat over this stroke of fortune. The Gorp killed by Groft and the one stunned by Dane were only the vanguard of an army, and within moments the hunters on the reef were confronted by trouble armed with slashing claws and diabolic fighting ability. The battle was anything but one-sided. Dane whirled as the air was rent by a shriek of agony, just in time to see one of the Salariki, already torn by the claws of a Gorp, being drawn under the water. It was too late to save the hunter, though Dane, balanced on the very edge of the reef, aimed a beam into the bloody waves. If the Gorp was affected by this attack, he could not tell, for both attacker and victim could no longer be seen. But Ollie had better luck in rescuing the Salaric who shared his particular section of reef, and the native, gashed and spurting blood from a wound in his thigh, was hauled to safety. while the Gorp, coiling too slowly under the Terran ray, was literally hewn to pieces by the revengeful knives of the hunter's kin. The fight broke into a series of individual duels, carried on now by the light of the torches as the evening closed in. The last of the purple patches had burned away to nothing. Dane crouched by his standard torch, his eyes fastened on the sea, watching for an ominous V of ripples betraying another Gorp on its way to launch against the rock barrier. There was such wild confusion along that line of water-sprayed rocks that he had no idea of how the engagement was going. But so far the Gorp showed no signs of having had enough. Dane was shaken out of his absorption by another scream. One, he was sure, which had not come from any Salariki throat. He got to his feet. Rip was stationed 4 men beyond him. Yes, the tall astrogator apprentice was there, outlined against the torch flare. Ollie? No, there was the assistant engineer. Weeks? But Weeks was picking his way back along the reef toward the shore, haste expressed in every line of his figure. The scream sounded for a second time, freezing the Terrans. "Come back!" That was Weeks, gesturing violently at the shore and something floundering in the protective circle of the reef. The younger Salariki who had been feeding the fire were now clustered at the water's edge. Ollie ran and with a leap covered the last few feet, landing reckless knee-deep in the waves. Dane saw light strike on his rod as he swung it in a wide arc to center on the struggle churning the water into foam. A third scream died to a moan, and then the Salariki dashed into the sea, their nets spread, drawing back with them through the surf a dark and now quiet mass. The fact that at least one Gorp had managed to get on the inner side of the reef made an impression on the rest of the native hunters. After an uncertain minute or two, Groft gave the signal to withdraw, which they did with grisly trophies. Dane counted 7 Gorp bodies, which did not include the prisoner ashore. And more might have slid into the sea to die. On the other hand, 2 Salariki were dead. One had been drawn into the sea before Dane's eyes, and at least one was badly wounded. But who had been pulled down in the shallows? Someone sent out from the Queen with a message? Dane raced back along the reef, not waiting to pull up his torch, and before he reached the shore Rip was overtaking him. But the man who lay groaning on the sand was not from the Queen. The torn and blood-stained tunic covering his lacerated shoulders had the IS badge. Ollie was already at work on his wounds, giving temporary first aid from his belt kit. To all their questions he was stubbornly silent. Either he couldn't or wouldn't answer. In the end, they helped the Salariki rig 3 stretchers. On one, the largest, the captive Gorp, still curled in a round carapace-protected ball, was bound with the net. The second supported the wounded Salaric clansman, and onto the third the Terrans lifted the IS man. "We'll deliver him to his own ship," Rip decided. "He must have tailed us here as a spy." He asked a passing Salaric as to where they could find the company spacer. "They might just think we are responsible," Ollie pointed out. "But I see your point. If we do pack him back to the Queen and he doesn't make it, they might say that we fired his rockets for him. All right, boys, let's up ship. He doesn't look too good to me." With a torch-bearing Salaric boy as a guide, they hurried along a path taking in turns the burden of the stretcher. Luckily, the IS ship was even closer to the sea than the Queen, and as they crossed the slagged ground, congealed by the break fire, they were trotting. Though the company ship was probably one of the smallest Intersolar carried on her rosters, it was a third again as large as the Queen, with part of that third undoubtedly dedicated to extra cargo space. Beside her, their own spacer would seem not only smaller, but battered and worn. but no free trader would have willingly assumed the badges of a company man, not even for the command of such a ship fresh from the cradles of a builder. When a man went up from the training pool for his first assignment, he was sent to the ship where his temperament, training, and abilities best fitted. And those who were designated as free traders would never fit into the pattern of company men. Of late years, the breach between those who lived under the strict parental control of one of the 5 great galaxy-wide organizations and those still too much of an individual to live any life but that of a half-explorer, half-pioneer, which was the free traders, had widened alarmingly. Antagonism flared, rivalry was strong. But as yet, the great companies themselves were at polite cold war with one another for the big plums of the scattered systems. The free traders took the crumbs, and there was not much disputing, save in cases such as had arisen on Sargol, when suddenly crumbs assumed the guise of very rich cake, rich and large enough to attract a giant. The party from the Queen was given a peremptory challenge as they reached the other ship's ramp. Rip demanded to see the officer of the watch, and then told the story of the wounded man as far as they knew it. The Izzy was hurried aboard, nor did his shipmates give a word of thanks. "That's that," Rip shrugged. "Let's go before they slam the hatch so hard they'll rock their ship off her fins."
"Polite, aren't they?" asked Weeks mildly.
"What do you expect of Izzy's?" Ollie wanted to know. "To them, free traders are just rim planet trash. Let's report back where we are appreciated." They took a shortcut which brought them back to the Queen, and they filed up her ramp to make their report to the captain. But they were not yet satisfied with Groft and his Gorp-slayers. No Salariki appeared for trade in the morning, surprising the Terrans. Instead, a second delegation, this time of older men and a storm priest, visited the spacer with an invitation to attend Paff's funeral feast, a rite which would be followed by the formal elevation of Groff to his father's position, now that he had revenged that parent. And from remarks dropped by members of the delegation, it was plain that the bearing of the Terrans who had joined the hunting party was esteemed to have been in the highest accord with Salariki tradition. They drew lots to decide which 2 must remain with the ship, and the rest perfumed themselves so as to give no offense which might upset their now cordial relations. Again, it was mid-afternoon when the Salariki's escort sent to do them honor waited at the edge of the wood, and Mura and Tang saw them off. With a herald booming before them, they traveled the beaten earth road in the opposite direction from the trading center, off through the forest, until they came to a wide section of several miles which had been rigorously cleared of any vegetation which might give cover to a lurking enemy. In the center of this was a 12-foot-high stockade of the bright red, burnished wood which had attracted Weeks on the shore. Each paling was the trunk of a tree, and it had been sharpened at the top to a wicked point. On the field side was a wide ditch, crossed at the gate by a bridge, the planking of which might be removed at will. And as Dane passed over, he looked down into the moat that was dry. The Salariki did not depend upon water for a defense, but on something else which his experience of the previous night had taught him to respect. There was no mistaking that shade of purple. The highly inflammable scum the hunters had burnt from the top of the waves had been brought inland and lay a greasy blanket some 8 feet below. It would only be necessary to toss a torch on that, and the defenders of the stockade would create a wall of fire to baffle any attackers. The Salariki knew how to make the most of their world's natural resources. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Duelist's Challenge. Inside the red stockade there was a crowded community. The Salariki demanded privacy of a kind, and even the unmarried warriors did not share barracks, but each had a small cubicle of his own. So that the mud, brick, and timber erections of one of their clan cities resembled nothing so much as the comb cells of a busy beehive. Although Path's was considered a large clan, it numbered only about 200 fighting men and their numerous wives, children, and captive servants. Not all of them normally lived at this center, but for the funeral feasting they had assembled, which meant a lot of doubling up and tenting out under makeshift cover between the regular buildings of the town, so that the Terrans were glad to be guided through this crowded maze to the great hall which was its heart. As the trading center had been, the hall was a circular enclosure open to the sky above, but divided in wheel-spoke fashion with posts of the red wood, each supporting a metal basket filled with inflammable material. Here were no lowly stools or trading tables. One vast circular board, broken only by a gap at the foot, ran completely around the wall. At the end opposite the entrance was the high chair of the chieftain, set up on a 2-step dais. Though the feast had not yet officially begun, the Terrans saw that the majority of the places were already occupied. They were led around the perimeter of the enclosure to places not far from the high seat. Van Ryck settled down with a grunt of satisfaction. It was plain that the free traders were numbered among the nobility. They could be sure of good trade in the days to come. Delegations from the neighboring clans arrived in close companies of 10 or 12, and were granted seats, as had been the Terrans, in groups. Dane noted that there was no intermingling of clan with clan, and, as they were to understand later that night, there was a very good reason for that precaution. "Hope all our adaptation shots work," Ollie murmured, eyeing with no pleasure at all the succession of platters now being borne through the inner opening of the table. While the traders had learned long ago that the wisest part of valor was not to sample alien strong drinks, ceremony often required that they break bread, or its otherworld equivalent, on strange planets. And so science served expediency, and now a trader bound for any galactic banquet was immunized, as far as was medically possible, against the evil consequences of consuming food not originally intended for Terran stomachs. One of the results being that Terrans acquired a far-flung reputation for possessing bird-like appetites, since it was always better to nibble and live than to gorge and die. Groft had not yet taken his place in the vacant chieftain's chair. For the present, he stood in the center of the table's circle, directing the captive slaves who circulated with the food. Until the magic moment when the clan themselves would proclaim their overlord, he remained merely the eldest son of the house, relatively without power. As the endless rows of platters made their way about the table, the basket lights on the tops of the pillars were ignited, dispelling the dusk of evening. And there was an attendant stationed by each to throw on handsful of aromatic bark, which burned with puffs of lavender smoke, adding to the many warring scents. The Terrans had recourse at intervals to their own pungent smelling bottles, merely to clear their heads of the drugging fumes. Luckily, Dane thought as the feast proceeded, that smoke from the braziers went straight up. Had they been in a roofed space, they might have been overcome. As it was, were they entirely conscious of all that was going on around them? His reason for that speculation was the dance now being performed in the center of the hall, their fight with the Gorp being enacted in a series of bounds and stabbings. He was sure that he could no longer trust his eyes when the claw knife of the victorious dancer-hunter apparently passed completely through the chest of another wearing a grotesque monster mask. As a fitting climax to their horrific display, 3 of the men who had been with them on the reef entered, dragging behind them, still enmeshed in the hunting net, the Gorp which Dane had stunned. It was uncurled now, and very much alive, but the pincer claws which might have cut its way to safety were encased in balls of hard substance. Freed from the net, suspended by its sealed claws, the gorp swung back and forth from a standard set up before the high seat. Its murderous jaws snapped futilely, and from it came an enraged snake's vicious hissing. Though totally in the power of its enemies, it gave an impression of terrifying strength and menace. The sight of their ancient foe aroused the Salariki, in flaming warriors who leaned across the table to hurl tongue-twisting invective at the captive monster. Dane gathered that seldom had a living gorp been delivered helpless into their hands, and they proposed to make the most of this wonderful opportunity. And the Terran suddenly wished the monstrosity had fallen back into the sea. He had no soft thoughts for the gorp after what he had seen at the reef and the tales he had heard, but neither did he like what he saw now expressed in gestures, heard in the tones of voices about them. A storm priest put an end to the outcries. His dun cloak making a spot of darkness amid all the flashing color, he came straight to the place where the gorp swung. As he took his stand before the wriggling creature, the din gradually faded. The warriors settled back into their seats. A pool of quiet spread through the enclosure. Groft came up to take his position beside the priest. With both hands he carried a two-handled cup. It was not the ornamented goblet which stood before each diner, but a manifestly older artifact, fashioned of some dull black substance, and having the appearance of being even older than the hall or town. One of the warriors who had helped to bring in the gorp now made a quick and accurate cast with a looped rope, snaring the monster's head and pulling back almost at a right angle. With deliberation, the storm priest produced a knife, the first straight-bladed weapon Dane had seen on Sargol. He made a single thrust in the soft underpart of the gorp's throat, catching in the cup he took from Groft some of the ichor which spurted from the wound. The gorp thrashed madly, spattering table and surrounding Salariki with its life fluid, but the attention of the crowd was riveted elsewhere. Into the old cup the priest poured another substance from a flask brought by an underling. He shook the cup back and forth, as if to mix its contents thoroughly, and then handed it to Groft. Holding it before him, the young chieftain leaped to the tabletop, and so to stand before the high seat. There was a hush throughout the enclosure. Now even the gorp had ceased its wild struggles and hung limp in its bonds. Groft raised the cup above his head and gave a loud shout in the archaic language of his clan. He was answered by a chant from the warriors who would in battle follow his banner, chant punctuated with the slinking slap of knife blades brought down forcibly on the board. 3 times he recited some formula and was answered by the others. Then, in another period of sudden quiet, he raised the cup to his lips and drank off its contents in a single draught, turning the goblet upside down when he had done to prove that not a drop remained within. A shout tore through the great hall. The Salariki were all on their feet, waving their knives over their heads in honor to their new ruler. And Groft, for the first time, seated himself in the high seat. The clan was no longer without a chieftain. Groft held his father's place. "Show over?" Dane heard Stott's murmur and Van Ryck's disappointing reply. "Not yet. They'll probably make a night of it. Here comes another round of drinks." And trouble with them. That was Captain Jellicoe being prophetic. "By the Coalsack's ripcord!" That exclamation had been jolted out of Rip, and Dane turned to see what had so jarred the usually serene astrogator apprentice. He was just in time to witness an important piece of Sargolian social practice. A young warrior, surely only within a year or so of receiving his knife, was facing an older Salaric, both on their feet. The head and shoulder fur of the older fighter was dripping wet, and an empty goblet rolled across the table to bump to the floor. A hush had fallen on the immediate neighbors of the pair, and there was an air of expectancy about the company. "Threw his drink all over the other fellow," Rip's soft whisper explained. "That means a duel." Here and now? Dane had heard of the personal combat proclivities of the Salariki. "Should be to the death for an insult such as that," Ollie remarked, as usual surveying the scene from his chosen role as bystander. As a child, he had survived the unspeakable massacres of the Crater War. Nothing had been able to crack his surface armor since. The young fool! That was Steen Wilcox sizing up the situation from the angle of a naturally cautious nature and some 15 years of experience on a great many different worlds. He'll be mustered out for good before he knows what happened to him. The younger Salarik had barked a question at his elder, and had been promptly answered by that dripping warrior. Now their neighbors came to life with an efficiency which suggested that they had been waiting for such a move. It had happened so many times that every man knew just the right procedure from that point on. In order for a Sargalian feast to be a success, the Terrans gathered from overheard remarks at least one duel must be staged sometime during the festivities. And those not actively engaged did a lot of brisk betting in the background. "Look there, at that fellow in the violet cloak," Rip directed Dane. "See what he just laid down?" The nobleman in the violet cloak was not one of Groff's liege men, but a member of the delegation from another clan. And what he had laid down on the table, indicating as he did so his choice as winner in the coming combat, the elder warrior, was a small piece of white material, on which reposed a slightly withered but familiar leaf. The neighbor he wagered with eyed the stake narrowly, bending over to sniff at it, before he piled up 2 gem-set armlets, a personal scent box, and a thumb ring to balance. At this practical indication of just how much the Terran herb was esteemed, Dane regretted anew their earlier ignorance. He glanced along the board and saw that Van Ryck had noted that stake and was calling their captain's attention to it. But such side issues were forgotten as the duelists vaulted into the circle rimmed by the table, a space now vacated for their action. They were stripped to their loincloths, their cloaks thrown aside. Each carried his net in his right hand, his claw-knife ready in his left. As yet the traders had not seen Salarik against Salarik in action, and in spite of themselves they edged forward in their seats, as intent as the natives upon what was to come. The finer points of the combat were lost on them, and they did not understand the drilled casts of the nets, which had become as formalized through the centuries as the ancient and now almost forgotten swordplay of their own world. The young Salarik had greater agility and speed, but the veteran who faced him had the experience. To Terran eyes, the duel had some of the weaving, sweeping movements of the earlier ritual dance. The swift evasions of the nets were graceful, and so timed that many times the meshes grazed the skin of the fighter who fled entrapment. Dane believed that the elder man was tiring, and the youngster must have shared that opinion. There was a leap to the right, a sudden flurry of dart and retreat, and then a net curled high and fell, enfolding flailing arms and kicking legs. When the clutch rope was jerked tight, the captured youth was thrown off balance. He rolled frenziedly, but there was no escaping from the imprisoning strands. A shout applauded the victor. He stood now above his captive, who lay supine, his throat or breast ready for either stroke of the knife his captor wished to deliver. But it appeared that the winner was not minded to end the encounter with blood. Instead, he reached out a long, befurred arm, took up a filled goblet from the table, and with serious deliberation poured its contents onto the upturned face of the loser. For a moment there was a dead silence around the feast board, and then a second roar, to which the honestly relieved Terrans added spurts of laughter. The sputtering youth was shaken free of the net and went down on his knees, tendering his opponent his knife, which the other thrust along with his own into his sash-belt. Dane gathered from overheard remarks that the younger man was, for a period of time to be determined by clan council, now the servant-slave of his overthrower, and that since they were closely united by blood ties, this solution was considered eminently suitable, though had the elder killed his opponent, no one would have thought the worse of him for that deed. It was the Queen's men who were to provide the next center of attraction. Groft climbed down from his high seat and came to face across the board those who had accompanied him on the hunt. This time there was no escaping the sipping of the potent drink, which the new chieftain slopped from his own goblet into each of theirs. The fiery mouthful almost gagged Dane, but he swallowed manfully and hoped for the best, as it burned like acid down his throat into his middle, there to mix uncomfortably with the viands he had eaten. Week's thin face looked very white, and Dane noticed with malicious enjoyment that Ollie had an obtrusive grip on the table, which made his knuckles stand out in polished knobs, proving that there were things which could upset the imperturbable Camille. Fortunately, they were not required to empty that flowing bowl in one gulp as Groft had done. The ceremonial mouthful was deemed enough, and Dane sat down thankfully, but with uneasy fears for the future. Groft had started back to his high seat when there was an interruption which had not been foreseen. A messenger threaded his way among the serving men and spoke to the chieftain, who glanced at the Terrans and then nodded. Dane, his queasiness growing every second, was not attending until he heard a bitten-off word from Rip's direction and looked up to see a party of the IS men coming into the open space before the high seat. The men from the Queen stiffened. There was something in the attitude of the newcomers which hinted at trouble. "What do you wish, Sky Lords?" That was Groft using the trade lingo, his eyes half closed as he lolled in his chair of state, almost as if he were about to witness some entertainment provided for his pleasure. "We wish to offer you the good fortune desires of our hearts." That was Callie, the flowery words rolling with the proper accent from his tongue. "And that you shall not forget us, we also offer gifts." At a gesture from their cargo-master, the IS men set down a small chest. Groft, his chin resting on a clenched fist, lost none of his lazy air. "They are received," he retorted with the formal acceptance, "and no one can have too much good fortune. The howlers of the black winds know that." But he tendered no invitation to join the feast. Callie did not appear to be disconcerted. His next move was one which took his rivals by surprise, in spite of their suspicions. "Under the laws of fellowship, O Groft," he clung to the formal speech, "I claim redress." Ollie's hand moved. Through his growing distress, Dane saw Van Ryck's jaw tighten. The fighting mask snapped back on Captain Jellicoe's face. Whatever came now was real trouble. Groff's eyes flickered over the party from the Queen. Though he had just pledged cup friendship with 4 of them, he had the malicious humor of his race. He would make no move to head off what might be coming. "By the right of the knife and the net," he intoned, "you have the power to claim personal satisfaction. Where is your enemy?" Callie turned to face the free traders. "I hereby challenge a champion to be set out from these off-worlders to meet by the blood and by the water my champion." The Salariki were getting excited. This was superb entertainment, an engagement such as they had never hoped to see, alien against alien. The rising murmur of their voices was like the growl of a hunting beast. Groft smiled, and the pleasure that expression displayed was neither Terran nor human. But then the clan leader was not either, Dane reminded himself. 4 of these warriors are clan-bound, he said. but the others may produce a champion." Dane looked along the line of his comrades. Ollie, Rip, Weeks, and himself had just been ruled out. That left Jellicoe, Van Ryck, Carl Costi, the giant jetman whose strength they had to rely upon before, Stotts the engineer, Medic Tau, and Steen Wilcox. If it were strength alone, he would have chosen Costi, but the big man was not too quick a thinker. Jellicoe got to his feet, the embodiment of a Star Lane fighting man. In the flickering light, the scar on his cheek seemed to ripple. "Who's your champion?" he asked Callie. The IZ cargo master was grinning. He was confident he had pushed them into a position from which they could not extricate themselves. "You accept challenge?" he countered. Jellicoe merely repeated his question, and Callie beckoned forward one of his men. The IZ who stepped up was no match for Costi. He was a slender, almost wan-slim young man, whose pleased smirk said that he, too, was about to put something over on the notorious free traders. Jellicoe studied him for a couple of long seconds, during which the hum of Salariki voices was the threatening buzz of a disturbed wasp's nest. There was no way out of this. To refuse conflict was to lose all they had won with the clansmen, and they did not doubt that Callie had, in some way, triggered the scales against them. Jellicoe made the best of it. "We accept challenge." His voice was level. "We, being guesting in Groff's holding, will fight after the manner of the Salariki, who are proven warriors." He paused as roars of pleased acknowledgment arose around the board. "Therefore, let us follow the custom of warriors and take up the net and the knife." Was there a shade of dismay on Callie's face? "And the time?" Groff leaned forward to ask, but his satisfaction at such a fine ending for his feast was apparent. This would be talked over by every Sargolian for many storm seasons to come. Jellicoe glanced up at the sky. "Say, an hour after dawn, chieftain. With your leave, we shall confer concerning a champion." "My council room is yours." Groff signed for a liege man to guide them. End of Chapter 6.